certainly the mocking of Christianity is tied with the cultural growth that eventually leads to actual persecution and martyrdom. I found 50 to 70,000 Christians were killed specifically for their, in that instance, their Catholic faith within Spain when the Republicans, which was a conglomerate of communists, socialists, anarchists, and secular liberals, were able to take power of Spain and sort of undermine the monarchy and the authority of the Catholic Church. From what I found, they've killed hundreds of thousands of Christians over the last decade or so. All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today we're going to be learning about the history of Christian persecution. I've selected 4 specific time periods. One, as I'm sure you would already guess, the early Roman persecution, everything before Constantine and the battle at the Milvian Bridge, the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Spanish Civil War. Those are the 4 periods which we're going to be discussing. And then I have tons of articles looking at Christian persecution around the world, as it is still in the 21st century the most persecuted religious tradition around the globe. And we'll be looking at places like the Middle East, Nigeria, China, North Korea. So the second half I'll be beginning with something you may be familiar with called the Gates of Toledo. And we'll be looking at the growth of aspects of Christian persecution. So are Christians persecuted in the West right now? Certainly martyrdom isn't as prevalent as it was in other periods within history, but I will be, and in the opening monologue here, I will be discussing some of the commonalities we're seeing in the 21st century as it relates to early Roman persecution, the French Revolution, the Bolsheviks, and of course, the Spanish Civil War. So I'll be getting into things that are a little bit hairy. Things, again, it'd be better to say over on the website than here on YouTube. So again, the Dionysian celebration and mocking of the Last Supper, and certainly the mocking of Christianity is tied with the cultural growth that eventually leads to actual persecution and martyrdom. And I want to talk about the Olympics, about DJ Barbara Butch, the lesbian, Jewish, obese DJ that mocked and played Jesus Christ at the Olympics. We'll be talking about Thomas Jolly, the gay Jewish man who organized the Olympic celebration. We'll be talking about a woman named Marina Abramovich, who I recently found out, thanks to Mike Ben sharing it on X, that she is one of the official artists of the U.S. State Department. And we'll be looking at a little bit of what she has to say and her art, and again, how it relates to subversion, mockery, and essentially Satanism. And so we'll be getting into things like the Synagogue of Satan and certain religious traditions that seem to be guilty of mocking Christ more so than others. And interestingly enough, even after the Olympic ceremony mockery of the Last Supper, it was pretty eye-opening to see how many Muslims were upset about it. Obviously not to the same degree as Christians, and the response to mockery and persecution in various ways is Orthodox Christians, or Christians generally speaking, have a different response than maybe Muslims do. But we'll be talking about and relating mass immigration, again, the Gates of Toledo, various groups of people, and how this all connects together. So that's going to be the second half. That's going to be on the website. And this first half is really going to be focused on a historical overview, looking at the ways in which Christians were killed. So I have a whole section on 10 ways in which Christians were martyred and tortured throughout history. We'll be looking and then reading an overview of Roman persecution and 3 specific emperors. Then we'll be looking at the French Revolution. So, to begin, Roman persecution is obviously related to the Christians refusing to burn incense to the emperor. And so the refusal to participate in sort of secular pagan activities. And from what I found, at least tens of thousands to 200,000 Christians were martyred by the Romans. Now, this is going to be absolutely dwarfed by the Bolsheviks. In the French Revolution, what I found is that it's somewhere at least 16,000 Christians were guillotined, And in the ballpark of 200,000 plus were killed during the French Revolution. And the Bolsheviks, from everything that I was reading, again, the low end among secular scholars is 12 million, and the general consensus amongst Christians is around 20 million plus were martyred by the Bolsheviks and the USSR. In the Spanish Civil War, a period that I hadn't heard many people discuss, I found 50 to 70,000 Christians were killed specifically for their, in that instance, their Catholic faith within Spain, when the Republicans, which was a conglomerate of communists, socialists, anarchists, and secular liberals, were able to take power of Spain and sort of undermine the monarchy and the authority of the Catholic Church. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll look at global persecution in the 21st century. Places like Nigeria are actually the leader in Christian persecution right now, and so northern Nigeria is ruled by people like Boko Haram, very militant Islamic groups. And from what I found, they've killed hundreds of thousands of Christians over the last decade or so. So we'll be looking at all that stuff, China, again, North Korea, all that. And then when we get into discussing both Orthodox and Catholic, because when we were focusing on the French Revolution and the Spanish Civil War, obviously the vast majority of those killed in the name of Christ were Catholic. That is not to validate the Catholic Church or their sacraments as Orthodox Christians, but to demonstrate the general persecution and attack on the faith. Here, I want to show you guys 10 horrifying tortures of early Christians. So how did they kill early Christians? This I found fascinating. And so we're just going to read again the 10 ways in which they were killed historically. And we can point towards also in the Bolshevik Revolution, it wasn't uncommon that they would tie Christians to two different horses, and then they would begin to sprint in opposite directions to literally tear the limbs off Christians. This is a recorded historical fact. The first one is cooked to death. This is St. Lawrence of Rome is well known for the manner of his death than his ministry in life. When a Roman prefect demanded that tithes of the church be handed over to the Roman state, Lawrence brought forth his impoverished congregation, who he stated were the tithes, as the money had been given them for food. The infuriated prefect ordered metal plates to be set over a bed of coals and heated until they were red hot. Lawrence was then bound and laid naked on them face up. His flesh sizzled, smoked, and was burned black, yet Lawrence made no outcry, nor did he beg forgiveness from the prefect. He finally called in a clear voice, "I am done on that side. Turn me over and eat." This is how the patron saint of cook. He is now the patron saint of cooks. Peter, a eunuch of Diocletian's household, was discovered to be a Christian and cooked in the same manner as Lawrence of Rome. Number 9, dragged to death. Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, founded the Christian church in Alexandria and preached to the masses that they should give up their Egyptian gods and goddesses. It's not clear how long he was able to keep this up, but he did convert many before AD 68, when an angry mob tied a rope around his neck and dragged him through the streets behind a chariot for 2 days without interruption. The dragging continued even after his death until his bones were showing. According to some sources, Hippolytus of Rome, an elder under Pope Pontian, was dragged to death behind a wild horse on the island of Sardinia. He is now the patron saint of horses. In 257, Saturnius of Toulouse was dragged behind a bull around the city until the bull was chased down a flight of stone steps, and Saturnian's brain was dashed from his skull. Julian the Apostate succeeded Constantinus II, who succeeded his father Constantine the Great in 361. Julian restored the pagan religion to the empire and horribly persecuted Christians. Within 2 years, he was ordering them sought out and dragged to death in every city, along with the caravan routes throughout Palestine. Skinned. Number 8. Removal of the skin is so excruciating that victims invariably passed out multiple times during the torture. To prevent this, they were usually hung upside down, so the excess blood flow to their brains forced them to remain conscious. The skin is not easy to remove, and torturers rarely made an effort to remove it in one piece unless they wanted a trophy. Typically, the skin was sliced into strips, then each strip peeled from the body with the aid of a knife. Often the skin was thrown into a fire or to animals or dangled before the victim's eyes. This is how Bartholomew, one of the 12 apostles, was killed by the locals in Armenia, into whose language he translated Matthew's gospel. The Armenians refused to abandon their idols and executed Bartholomew by crucifying him upside down and skinning him. Sewn into skins and eaten by dogs. This torture was devised by Nero himself, not merely to cause Christians pain, but to entertain him and his guests. Nero was infamously rumored to have crucified Christians on trees in his gardens, coated them with wax, and set them on fire to light his nightly walks. He evidently didn't mind the stench. Others he ordered sewn into hides. Any large animal was skinned, and the prepared skin sewn around the victims, except the heads, hands, and feet. Then ravenous dogs were set loose. The victim could only scuttle around on all fours like a crab. Nero was said to have laughed heartily as the dogs gnawed at the skin as they would a bone. And so Julian of Antioch was tortured every day for an entire year and displayed to the crowds in every town in Cilicia. We'll go to the next one. 6, starved to death. Emperor Decius ruled from 249 to 251 when he was killed at the Battle of Abritus in Bulgaria. During his short reign, he had a temple built in Ephesus and required that all Christians sacrifice for the good of the emperor, not to the emperor, since this would impute divinity to Decius, who was still alive. This was against Roman law, but the Christians largely considered any similar sacrifice counter their faith and refused, even when warned that they would be tortured to death. Pope Fabian himself was beheaded over the issue. Boiled to death. Boiling water causes almost instant first-degree burns and will cause third-degree burns after 10 minutes. Eventually, the flesh will slough away deep into the muscle, and death is usually marked by the water turning red as it finally breaches the blood vessels. Tradition holds that John the Apostle, who wrote the Gospel of John, survived without harm after being boiled in a cauldron of oil, after which he was exiled to Patmos Island in the Aegean. In 222, a woman named Cecilia, possibly Saint Cecilia, was boiled in a bathtub over a bed of coals for a day and a half after she converted her husband and brother. They were beheaded, as was the captain who led them to their deaths, because he converted in view of their victims' fearlessness. The Inquisition's auto da fe. By the 13th century, everybody expected the Spanish Inquisition. The church formed inquisitions in every country in Western Europe, but the Spanish was the most brutal and feared. Anyone found guilty even of reading the Bible in his or her own language was tried, usually convicted, and often executed. The ceremony of execution was torture and was called an auto da fe, the act of faith. The Inquisition was required not to spill any blood in performing tortures, but this requirement was usually ignored. Ground to death in a mill, number 3. Under the rule of Maximian, Saint Victor Marcus may have suffered the most excruciating death of all. He secretly ministered to his parishioners in Milan until about 303, when he was discovered and immediately dragged through the streets behind a horse while the crowd stripped him naked and beat him, then demanded him recant. He refused and was stretched on the rack for a day, during which time he prayed to God for patience. He was then imprisoned and immediately converted 3 of his guards. When Maximian heard of this, he ordered the guards beheaded, and Victor racked again. While the torturers beat him savagely with clubs, he was ordered to recant and refused a 3rd time. Maximian had a Roman altar built and ordered Victor to sacrifice incense on it to Jupiter. This enraged Victor, who kicked over the altar. Maximian furiously ordered the offending foot cut off, after which Victor was flung into a stone mill used to grind up wheat into flour, and the torturers ground him to death. Number 4, broken on the wheel. This one is nasty. The breaking wheel is a horribly painful method of torture in which the victim was tied to the side of a wheel laid flat on the ground. Then one of the two methods was employed. Either the torturer used a sledgehammer to smash every limb to pulp, or the wheel was made to turn in transection with another, like gears, so that the victim's body was crushed between them. No bone or section of bone was spared, except the torso and head to keep the victim alive. Sometimes the genitals were smashed. Then the victim was left in the condition to die from exposure, blood loss, or to be beaten by birds and ants. This was the fate of a man called Peter. In about 250, he was martyred along with three others, Paul, Andrew, and Dionysia. Dionysia was condemned to be raped to death, but tradition holds that an angel spared her, and the three nominated rapists ran away in fear. She then escaped prison, but desired to be martyred like her friends and allowed the authorities to recapture her. She was beheaded, and Paul and Andrew were stoned. Peter was broken on the wheel, then beheaded. And then the number one torture that was, again, aimed at Christians is having their guts eaten by pigs. This is terrible. In 363, under Julian the Apostate, St. Marcus was bishop of Arethusa, a town near modern Apamea in Syria. Julian ordered Marcus to repair a dilapidated pagan temple, but Marcus destroyed it instead, then fled the city. He soon realized that his Christian followers would pay for what had been done if he did not return, so he did. The enraged townspeople dragged him through the streets, stripped him naked, stabbed him all over his body with their pencils and quills, then smeared him with honey and suspended him in a basket in a town square where the wasps and bees would swarm into the basket and devour him. Several of his followers were discovered and dragged down by the mob, who ripped their bellies open with their bare hands. Corn was packed into their abdomens, and pigs were set on them. The pigs devoured the corn and their intestines. So I say all this, guys, to give you a little bit of insight in regards to the lengths of Christian persecution and what some of our saints, martyrs, and ancestors actually had to deal with.